Okay, all right, thank you very much. Yeah, so I want to give a kind of overview for everyone for probably about the culmination of about 10 years worth of work at the EBI on hopefully give you a good overview on how we're using ontology semantics to deal with the sort of large volumes and complexity of biological data and biological metadata that we manage and serve back to the community at the EBI. This clicker's not working, that's fine. So for any of you that are not familiar with who the EBI is, so we are the home for biological data services and research in Europe. We are a trusted provider of life science data, so we're really an archive of public, openly available genomics data. We're part of the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, which is a large network of research labs around Europe. And we're based on a site just outside Cambridge. There's about 650 staff members there. And really, yeah, the goal of the Institute, one of the goals is to make this public data, well, we want to archive it, so for long-term storage, and then also then to add value to this data. And we add value to the data through using ontologies and semantics so that we can make the data more interoperable and then serve it back to users. And hopefully we get from this kind of path, from going from the kind of the raw biological data in the archives, and we want to get this through to kind of actionable knowledge around genes, proteins, and eventually thinking about drug targets and drug discovery. So we have a lot of databases, and this kind of gives you a kind of overview that we have databases dealing with the literature, and then everything down from the archival resources that archive sequence data, and then we kind of build up in layers of abstraction over this. So from the sequence data, we build up to the annotations for the genes and the proteins, and then we look at the functional annotation of the genes and the proteins, structural annotation, right through to chemistry, like I mentioned, drugs and drug targets, right up to biological systems. So we have all these layers of abstraction where we start with the raw data, and we're always adding these layers of curation to turn this raw data into knowledge and what we understand about basic biology. So unsurprisingly, there's a lot of metadata, and there's a lot of variety in the metadata that we see. And I would think specifically in the areas that we focus on, and when we're looking at genomics, we're interested in, okay, where are these genes, where are they having effect? We have cell lines and models for behavior, and we also are obviously interested in the study of disease. So I would say that these are the key areas that we try and focus on in terms of our standardization effort in the metadata. And when we actually look at the data, you can imagine that it's fairly messy. The data comes in all kind of variety of forms from public users, typically comes in sort of spreadsheet form, so we get a lot of this kind of key value data that is trying to convey what was done in the experiment. And we have to try and use this kind of somewhat messy data and get some signal and some sense out of it. So this slide just kind of, a simple search. If you just look in some of our sample databases for a keyword like female, you see all the variety of ways, and some people are trying to describe some attributes of their sample, and there's a whole bunch of kind of context going on in here that tells you actually a bit more about whether, whether it's a normal female, and sometimes you get these kind of funny cases where they actually put in female in the data, but they actually meant male. And there's all kinds of kind of horror stories of what you end up when you start sort of analyzing and looking deep into this data. So there's obviously a terminology challenge here that we want to try and understand what people are talking about so that we can integrate these data sets. And we need to be sure that people are talking about the same thing. So, we've got an example here of a word like tibia. Well, this has a meaning in human bones that's slightly different to the meaning when you're looking at fruit flies. And we have to understand that there's a context around this word. And the life science community have kind of recognized this challenge for a long time. We were chatting earlier, thinking that really there's a good now 20 years worth of history in bioinformatics of building not just standard vocabularies, but really full-blown OWL ontologies to try and deal with the terminology challenge that we have in the life sciences. So A lot of this work to develop standards around terminology is coordinated through the Open Biomedical Ontologies community. So this is a community of ontology developers in the life sciences who are agreeing sort of principles and guiding principles for how we should develop our ontologies to make sure that they're interoperable, so that not everyone is just creating a mass of terminologies and that don't work together well. And like I say, a lot of these ontologies are developed in OWL, so they're semantically rich. And then there's a whole bunch of other terminology standards that kind of live somewhat outside of the OBO community, but they're also standards that we're interested in. So there's a lot of clinical terminology standards in use, and we have to try and, through my team, kind of pull all these standards together and present them to the various databases in some sort of uniform way. So I run the ontologies team at EBI, and really our goal is to build services that make all this kind of ontology and terminology data accessible. Now, primarily focused accessible to humans, so the biological curators, so that they can actually access all these ontologies, because, I mean, they're all published all around the web. And also we want to make them accessible to machines so that people can build pipelines that utilize the ontologies, or people can do analysis with data that takes advantage of this rich data. We want to ensure that there's a consistent set of ontologies that we're using across the institute. So we have over 80 databases, and we want to be sure that all of our different databases are using the same standards. And also then the other databases in the US are using the same standards. So we want to try and make sure that we're converging as a community around the same standards to maximize the interoperability of the data that we're curating. And then we obviously have to find ways to kind of really scale this up. So the data is vast, and we need services and methods to be able to kind of assign these ontology terms to the metadata at scale, and make sure that we can prioritize our curation. And then the other interest of our group is then working with the teams that actually build the individual resources to say, okay, well now if you've got your data aligned to some standards, how do the developers learn about what they can do once they've got an OWL ontology? A lot of the developers aren't familiar with some of these kind of semantic technologies. They're probably using different types of storage mechanisms to more traditional ones that we might use when we're thinking about RDF data. So how do we maximize and utilize the ontologies in software? And I'll give you kind of overview now of the tools and the services that we've built to help do this. So before I get into that, I think the important thing is that there is an end result for all this work. And the end result from the kind of user is that they get to use these nice portals into the data. And when they're doing their searching and browsing around these portals, all this kind of integration that's happened in the background through the ontology, it's kind of transparent to the user. So we've got the gene expression database. So just a few examples here. So this is a place where you can come up, search by gene, and see how the gene is being expressed in different tissues and different species. And when you're doing a query, the ontologies are in the background. They're doing query expansion, and they're aggregating data for the user. Similarly, in the GWAS catalog, you can come and search for cardiovascular disease, so you can search for general concepts, and again, the ontologies in the background are expanding this, bringing back relevant results. And we have another portal, the Open Targets portal, so this is a drug discovery portal. And this integrates around 18 different databases, all against a set of common ontologies. And the nice thing about once we have a common set of ontologies is when we talk about cardiovascular disorders in here, we've got the same codes in here and in this database and in all the other databases. So we are sort of maximally interoperable across our resources. And yeah, this is just a page, again, showing on some sort of ontology-driven search on the Open Targets platform, so you can come and find potential drug targets, you can search by disease, and again, ontologies in the background are help driving the search and the query expansion here. So that's the end result. So I want to talk you now through the kind of process of how we get there at scale. So if we can imagine the data typically coming in like this kind of key value, it's all strings. And what we want to do is take something like here, we've got an annotation that says, okay, the cell type in this sample was a mast cell. We want to get this over to a concept like mast cell in the cell type ontology. And then from the cell type ontology, we get all this added value, so all this extra relationship, so we can also then immediately start to make inferences about this sample, that this is a secretory cell, and all these other types of functions of the cell. So if we can get this mapping done, then we get to a much richer pool of knowledge around these samples. But then the challenge then for the curators is where do they start? So how do you start with all these hundreds of ontologies, and which one should they be using? So we can enumerate the questions. So typically our users of our services, they want to know, okay, how do I access ontologies in the first place? How do I find them? How do I annotate my data with ontologies? So I've got data in a spreadsheet. How do I get from that to these kind of ontologies, this semantic markup? And which one should I be using? There's hundreds of them. And then what happens when I've got data that doesn't actually align to any of the existing ontologies? Where do I go next? Sometimes we have mapping problems, so sometimes data will come in and it's already mapped to one standard, but it's not the standard that we're using at the EBI, so we need to then have ways to map across ontologies. And then if people want to contribute, how can the curators actually say, okay, I'm an expert in this field, I want to start extending this portion of ontology because it's not representing my data well enough. And then finally, how do I build, once we've done all this, how do we build a smart application that can use it? So I'll cover all of these. So these are our 4 core tools that form our kind of ontology toolkit. So we have the Ontology Lookup service, which is a search engine for ontologies. We have our Zoomer system, which is for data annotation. We have OXO, which is an ontology mapping service. And we have Webulist, which is a tool for creating ontologies from spreadsheets. So there's a link here, if you can get the slides, kind of a portal into all our tools. Everything's on GitHub. Worth saying that all this is fully open source software, so you can get this. And none of this software is really tied to life science data. So most of this is just designed to work with our ontologies. Yeah, we've kind of been delving into the world of cloud, so you can kind of run these services in cloud environments now. So I'll start with the Ontology Lookup service. So this is a repository now of around 200 pre-selected ontologies. So we curate the actual ontologies that are out there and say, okay, these are the set that are relevant for data at EBI. There's around 5 million ontology terms in there. Like I say, it's primarily a search engine, so it's about just discovery of terms. We do ontology tracking, so every night we're polling all the ontologies, looking for changes so that you can see how ontologies are changing over time, or if terms have got deleted, or if they've been replaced. Systems can kind of automatically update against that. We have a number of visualization tools, which I'll show on the next slide. We have an API for programmatic access. And really the goal here is to say, okay, well, of these 200 ontologies, yes, most of them are in OWL, but sometimes they vary in how they might represent definitions or synonyms. And OLS aims to provide a unified interface. So we make sure that all those ontologies are as aligned as best we can, so you have a single interface to all these ontologies. And we have around 6,000 sort of active users a month, and around 50 million hits on the API, but this can go up to about 150 million. It depends if one of the big databases is doing a release, so they will often just throw all their data against the API and try and do their best effort at matching to ontologies. So we have some sort of typical ontology visualizations. We've got autocomplete boxes. These are kind of widgets that you can deploy then in other curation systems. We've got tree-based views. We've got graphical views of the ontology. But what we realize is that this isn't enough. Okay, so the problem with an ontology lookup service is if you don't know what you're looking for, you suddenly get lost. So a simple query for liver, you'll actually get about 2 pages of results in OLS because there's multiple ontologies from different species that talk about liver. So then it's, okay, well, which one should I be using? Which one is going to get me maximum interoperability with the other databases at the EBI? So we thought about this for a while, and we thought, well, we need to start collecting how these ontology terms are used so that we can then prioritize and actually give the user an informed result and say, actually, these 5 databases are using this concept, so if you use this one, then you're going to be aligned. So this is really what the Zoomer Knowledgebase does for us. It's we run it as an RDF triple store using W3C open annotation model to basically capture these annotations. And an annotation is essentially a database had a concept like heart or string, and they mapped it to this Uberon concept, and then we captured some of the provenance of when this curation was done and each of the databases where they used this concept. Now what this does then is it gives us then a training set to be able to predict when we see new types of string, we can have some kind of level of confidence about which terms we should be mapping to. And then it means that we don't have to keep redoing the same curation, so kind of the trivial stuff, when we see, okay, heart on its own, there's never really any question. We know that we should always probably be mapping to this, and the ambiguity is gone. So Zoomer has a simple kind of web interface, so you can kind of upload data, typically that you might get out of your spreadsheet, put all the terms in, tell Zoomer to go and annotate, and it'll then give you back a result. So in some cases, it comes back with a kind of confidence level. So this essentially means, okay, yeah, we've seen this before in a database, and we can be pretty confident that you can map. This is the term that you should be mapping to. But it doesn't always work. It's never that clean. So then you get this kind of scenario where in some cases, Zoomer's not quite sure, so there's a few concepts that are quite similar, and these just come from different ontologies, so it means we haven't really seen this before. And in this scenario, we want to get the curator's feedback, so they have a mechanism now where they can download these data, they can actually fix the mappings, and then they load them back into Zoomer, so we start to train the system, so that the next time we see type 2 diabetes mellitus, this should come back as high confidence because we've seen it and annotated it before. So that's the general idea with Zoomer. So then Zoomer's going from strings to concepts, and then we've got this kind of problem again that, well, sometimes you can map to a particular ontology, but it's not the right one. It's not the one that you want. So we have one data source here, and they're using SNOMED as a clinical terminology, and we've got another data source at the EBI that are using concepts from the human phenotype ontology, and we have to find ways to map between these ontologies. So mappings are complicated. There's a whole bunch of tools for doing predicted mapping, but again, we're focusing on the curation aspect because there's a whole bunch of curation going on mappings. So the Ontology Mapping Service is really a repository. It's a graph database that we use to collect all known mappings and cross-references that we can either extract from existing ontologies or mappings that particular teams have done. The semantics are quite broad in here, so it's kind of SCOS-like semantics. But we basically can start to build these kind of clusters of concepts. You'll see the different colors indicate a different vocabulary. And these are all concepts related to type 2 diabetes, but some of them come from MESH. This is from the human disease ontology. This is from the NCIT ontology. And what we found is that by putting sort of all the mappings that we can find together into a big graph, then we can start to poke this graph and start to produce kind of confidence scores on how confident we are a particular mapping is true, whether it's likely to be exact or whether these are kind of broader mappings. When you start to see these big clusters around generic concepts like cancer, then you have lots of things potentially mapping to that, and that's probably some indication that these aren't true exact matches. So really the OXO service is just about serving up those mappings to users. I'm going to just switch gears a bit and go now into a bit of the underlying technology if people are really interested in how OLS and OXO run. So we did about 6 years ago, I think, when we sort of first got introduced to Neo4j, we thought, well, this would be potentially a nice back-end database to store all these ontologies. It seemed like a natural representation. So at the time, we built our own importers for OWL into Neo4j. These were generic importers. And we really focus about collapsing the OWL representation into a sort of simpler graph that's optimized for most of the common queries. So, getting all the ancestor, computing the kind of transitive closures across these ontologies. And this brought with it a load of benefits because I can hire developers now who can actually work with Neo4j as opposed to in the past trying to find people to work with sort of OWL representations in triple stores and having to write Sparkle against the kind of the RDF serialization of OWL. If anyone's tried to do it, it's not the most friendly thing to do. So we've had quite good fun working with Neo4j and taking advantage of this really nice syntax to be able to do really common queries like, okay, I want get me all the classification for a concept like heart, and it's a very simple query in Neo4j, and I can easily extract the structure of the ontology from that, and it's super fast. So then that's the kind of the back end for the structure of the ontologies. We also do a lot of work then because, like I say, most of the databases at the EBI, they're probably using some kind of search technology like Elastic or Solr. So then we've been thinking about, well, how do you, when you've got this, you've got your data, you've annotated it to ontologies, we've got this structure, what's the best way to shove that structure into a document store so that we can do this query expansion? And we've written plugins for Elasticsearch and Solr, so where you can essentially, once you've got your data loaded into your document store and you've got one of your fields that's got an ontology concept, these plugins will identify the ontology concept, it will go to the Ontology Lookup service, and then it will start to pull out all the labels and synonyms and all the parent terms and all the related terms, and actually just inject them directly into your search index. So then you've got this kind of enriched index that you can do this kind of querying on. We're kind of seeing this pattern all over on different databases, that we're constantly kind of having to move from pushing the graph data representation into some kind of fast search index. And I presume that this is a kind of a common approach that people employ, and yeah, like I say, we're trying to build tooling around this. And yeah, this is how you get this nice query expansion. So behind the scenes of the GWAS catalog, it's a solar index, and you do a text search on cardiovascular disease, and you pull back variants associated to vascular constriction. So this is not a lexical match, this is an ontology-driven search result. So in the final bit, on what time I've got left, so that's really what I wanted to say about our kind of ontology stack and how we try and get from this messy data to ontologies and how we utilize that in applications. And then there's the final step, which is, okay, well, how do you publish and expose this data? We've done all this effort to do this nice semantic enrichment. And again, about 5 years ago, we started work on an EBI RDF platform. And currently, we focused on around 7 of the larger data sources at the EBI. And we built an RDF schema and put them all into a big Virtuoso triple store and put a Sparkle endpoint on top. And this is extremely powerful. You can do some queries on this platform that you can't do with the other services as they currently are. But we're also finding that this is a really hard platform to maintain because it's really at the end of an ETL process. This isn't the source of truth for the data. And anyone will know that, you know, over the years, these ETL processes, they get fragile, especially if people aren't kind of familiar with technologies like RDF that are a little bit specialized. So it's still running and it's still very powerful, but it generally has a kind of niche community that use this platform. This is just a little kind of schematic of the underlying schema in the RDF platform, so you can imagine all the obvious things. We connect genes to proteins, we've got information about the structures, linking through to reactions, protein function, drug targets, and disease. So this is the underlying schema. So since kind of this investment in exploration with RDF, we've been thinking about, okay, well, how can we do this more cheaply? So, well, every service is using REST, and every service is now generating JSON. And around the same time, JSON-LD was becoming popular, so kind of a new approach is, okay, well, can we use this as a way of harvesting RDF out of the individual resources, because then we're really getting the data from the source of truth. So this is the Ensembl API. They have quite a nice REST API. You can get all kinds of information about genes. And here's their kind of plain JSON output. And then we did some work to then kind of analyze this and say, well, could we align this JSON to the schema that I showed you before using JSON-LD? And with a little bit of fiddling, it kind of works. So we can define a context for an existing API that wasn't designed for RDF, but they had actually used some ontology concepts so that we can kind of map from their JSON using JSON-LD, and we get actual RDF out from this API now that is mostly aligned with the original RDF that we were trying to generate as part of the ETL process. So this seems plausible and possible that JSON-LD could be a good way for us to generate this kind of RDF data from the sources. And at the same time, kind of in parallel, we have another initiative going on at EBI and in Europe in general called BioSchemas, which is really an extension of schema.org. So this is a kind of alternate approach to say, okay, well, can we use the schema.org approach and try and push some of this markup that we've got into HTML? So there's a growing kind of community around this now. We're pushing standards for review for schema.org for all the kind of core data types that we have. And there's lots of pages now at EBI emerging with this kind of schema.org or bioschemas markup, again, exposing the ontology annotations through the web pages. So this is quite easy. A lot of the databases are able to implement this. I think then there's open questions for us about, well, who's going to do the crawling and where are we going to be able to get access to this? Because at the moment, these pages might be getting crawled, but we're not actually able to get access to the stuff that's crawled, and we're not really in the business of building our own crawlers. So it's an interesting project. So I'm going to finish now on this slide. I think I'm close to running out of time. So I think I just tried to come up with some things that we've learned maybe in doing this over the last 10 years. So obviously when we started, there was a few ontologies and it was all a bit chaotic, but actually this has really matured now, and there are a core set of well-developed ontologies in the life sciences, and there's consensus growing between us internationally on which ones we should be using. So this makes life a lot easier. I think our approaches to the crowdsourcing with Zuma and Oxo have proved that this is how we can actually scale up curation. We can get the curators to focus on the new data that needs curating and stop them sort of wasting time on data that another database has already seen and curated. So this is a good model for scaling. We are still ultimately retrofitting semantics onto data. The data is still, by and large, coming through still quite messy, and there's this still kind of, and we do quite well on the common concepts that we see, but there's this massive long tail in the metadata when you do the analysis of the stuff that either doesn't map to any existing ontology, and we don't really know what this metadata is saying. I think we've pushed quite hard with how far we can use OWL and OWL semantics, and this is really essential for how we build and maintain the ontologies. So all the ontologies that we develop are developed with OWL, and we really rely on the reasoners, and we hope that they continue to be developed because they're essential for building these ontologies when we're 30, 40,000 concepts in. But then we've had to devise pretty much our own custom ways then of taking that rich semantics and putting it into different storage solutions. So how do you take that rich semantics and put it into Neo4j to build an application, or put it into Elasticsearch? And then this other one is also important, is how we interact with the developers. So we have hundreds of software developers at the EBI. Most of them don't know about OWL RDF. They're slowly getting switched on to graph databases and things like that now. But again, they are using conventional software, they're using conventional technologies, REST and JSON, so we're constantly looking at how we can utilize the semantics in these kind of technologies that people are using. Okay, and I'll acknowledge the team and some of our funding sources, and hopefully I've got some time for questions. Thank you very much. That is certainly one of the things, on our kind of EBI tech radar that's now coming in that people are starting to adopt it. We personally haven't yet for these tools, but I think that would be possibly the next thing for us to try, is to put GraphQL services on top of our ontologies.
Given the complex networks, it could be quite beneficial for the client to decide how far they want to navigate and navigate.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, so it's something that we definitely want to look into, but we haven't done too much yet.
What about ontologies that contain some rules? I mean, rules like
swirl rules.
Similar.
I would say we don't see a lot of that. Of the core set of ontologies that we're using, we're not seeing a lot of that usage. So our tools aren't really taking any advantage of those. We're mostly working in a kind of small profile of OWL within EL, and because that can really scale for the reasoning, and we use one reasoner in ELK, and that covers most of what we need for the kinds of ontologies that we're building, I would say.
Yes, because I see that less and less reasoner in the South Port.
Yeah, it's certainly a concern if that. How active the reasoner developers are, but we hope they don't go away.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Yep. Thank you.